Hello and welcome to Feed Stuffs 365. I'm Ann Hess. Today's topic is a part two as we continue our discussion with Dr. Al Kurtz of Anthill LLD on the epidemiology of colostrum in New York Holstein herds. Welcome, Dr. Kurtz. Nice to see you again.
Good to be back, Ann. As you said, this is part two. The first part we covered last month. This one is going to be more about metabolic indicators and any potential nutrition effects on colostrum and its quality. So I'll give a brief overview from the last period. These farms were selected based on their previous participation and the consulting nutritionists and veterinarians and being involved. The ability to collect and record individual colostrum weights and volumes. Minimum herd size of 500 cows. Use of the dairy management software system. The software system, DairyCom 305, and heifer calves were housed on the site for at least the first week of life. I won't go into the details about the studies, but just generally contacted 51 farms. They had 19 that agreed to participate. About 21,000 individual animal colostrum records were collected. Herds range in size from 620 to 4,600, with most of them in 1,000, 2,000 range. And the medium colostrum yield was 4 liters with about a 25% brix for first calf heifers. Now, the interesting thing about that is the general recommendation is to provide 4 liters at the very first feeding. So the median is 4, so that means sometimes there wouldn't be enough produced, especially for first calf heifers. Older cows had a little bit more. And then they took some blood samples and then they took, did analysis on that. So if we look at the first segment, if you want to post that, there were 13 herds studied, visited 3 times and 6 4 times. Now, this was affected because right before they began the trial, COVID started to hit and that affected, visitations and those sorts of things. 2 of the herds fed separate close-up diets to heifers and cows, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Now, if we look at the table, you see that starch was fairly low and dairy cow diets were usually in the mid 20s and the upper 20%. So the mean and medium were the same, right at 21%. But there was a fair amount of range, actually 13.4 to 29.4. So that's quite a wide range, even though the average was right at 20. Amylase NDF, and that's a method where you treat it with an amylase enzyme first to get rid of the starch so it doesn't confound the NDF analysis. You see the mean was 31%, the median was 41%. So there was quite a bit of spread there, 13.5 to 50%. The crude protein was fairly similar, 14.6 to 14.3. 11.5 to 18.5. Now, some of those high and low numbers might have to do with the sample at a particular time. So that may not be as accurate as the actual mean. Crude protein is percent dry matter we just mentioned. Dietary cation anion difference in terms of meal equivalents. The mean was a minus 11.6. And if you'll recall, when you have a minus value, that helps mobilize blood calcium, so it minimizes hypocalcemia and milk fever. That's the approach there. So the mean was minus 11.6 and the median minus 12.0. But the range was minus 30 to 7. Now, part of the high end of that, the 7, might be because, remember, there were 2 herds that were fed separate close-up heifer and cow diets, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then the physically affected NDF was right at 30%. The particle size equal to or greater than 19 millimeters, that's about 3/4 of an inch. So that gives you an idea about how much particle size there was in a total mixed ration that was fed to the cows. And you see some range from 6.5 to 32. Hyperketonemia is like a subclinical stage of ketonemia, and that's usually related to how much body condition is being mobilized. So these samples would have been taken right before calving. So you see that as the dry matter intake decreases right before calving, there will be a tendency for more ketonemia to start to show up. And that's measured by NEFAs, which we'll come to in a minute. So now if we look at the next slide, we see that the final model they developed related to colostrum yield was had quite a few factors, which tells you it's not a simple analysis of what creates volume of colostrum and its quality. So included in that model were starch, protein percentage, DCAD, proportion of the diet with particle size greater than or equal to 19 millimeters, prevalence of hyperketonemia, a moderate herd prevalence of hyperketonemia was associated with the greatest colostrum yield. So that would indicate that while their dry matter intake was decreasing right before calving, they're mobilizing some body condition, and that helps them produce colostrum yield. Now, you don't want that to go too drastic or for too long a period of time, because then they're losing body condition. Now, there was a diet content by parity group interaction, so that for the first lactation, there was a difference than it was for the older cows, not in terms of particle length, but in terms of yield. So when there was a moderate protein percentage in the diet, 13.6 to 15.5%, older cows had a greater yield. But with the younger cows, it was the opposite. The lower the protein, the more colostrum yield they had. I'm not quite sure why that is. Maybe it's because they don't have as much of a decrease in dry matter intake right before calving and don't have as much as deficit after calving as older cows. And then if you look at the DCAD, the more negative it was, the older cows had less severe problems. Whereas with the heifers, it's not really that much associated. And the reason why there's several studies, particularly one at Michigan State, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, which they found that negative DCADs actually have a negative impact on heifers. They have lower dry matter intake, and subsequent milk production is not as good. And that's most likely because heifers, to start with, don't have the incidence of hyperketonemia or ketosis or milk fever or hypocalcemia. So the heifers aren't affected as much. So really, it's a good idea in general not to feed negative DCAD diets to heifers. And so that's why I think we had two herds that had separate close-up diets for their heifers and cows. The greatest colostrum yield from first calf heifers was associated with the lower protein, as we said. Um, let's see, lowest colostrum yield from older cows was associated with lower starch, which is somewhat surprising because starch is usually an indicator of how much rumen fermentation there would be. Maybe it prevents them from having some more marginal acidosis. Well, that's pretty low starch level for cows, even right before calving. Whereas the heifers had the opposite. The higher starch, they had lower yield. The Brix, which is an indicator of the degree of solids or how much immunoglobulin proteins there might be, was greatest with a lower NDF, and that might be because lower NDF is higher starch. and more fermentation. Um, and particle length is also related to that. There was a group interaction with those factors. And if we continue on down to that list, the greatest colostrum bricks, which is the amount of antibody proteins for first calf heifers, was associated with a low starch and lower moderate DCAD. So again, they are more negatively affected by DCAD the more negative the DCAD is in the diet. The greatest from older cows was associated with moderate DCAD. That's within that range of negative about 16 to negative 8. It was not associated with starch at all. So there's differences between the first calf heifers and the older cows. Now we look at the glucose concentration or body condition score. The greatest yield was associated with their prepartum NEFAs, that is non-esterified fatty acids, that were equal to or greater than 290 microequivalents per liter. What that means is that when these cows were, their intake was decreased right before calving and they're losing some body condition, that's when the NEFAs are released into the bloodstream when they're losing body condition. And so they actually had a greater colostrum yield when that occurred, which is normally what happens. And of course, we try to minimize the negative intake before calving, but there's really no way of doing that completely. And want to minimize how much body condition they lose. But this says that that actually has some beneficial effect if they're losing some body condition, then they have some higher NEFAs before they're calving because evidently they're using that energy to produce more colostrum. So then if we look at what the author said on this slide, you see that colostrum yield from older cows was lower when they had reduced DCAD, as we've discussed. And when this is not consistent, though, with other studies have been done, because other studies report no difference when cows were fed lower DCADs. In the current study, starch content was associated with colostrum yield. Generally, for older cows, it was a higher colostrum positive, lower colostrum for the heifers. Colostrum yield and Brix percent were associated with the proportion of the diet in the top sieve of the Penn State separator. So that's the particle length equal to or greater than 3/4 of an inch used in this study. So commonly observed in prepartum diets is a greater inclusion of bulky forages. So you expect to see that number higher than you would in lactating cow diets. In agreement with the current study, previous observation studies have not found an association between the body condition score and colostrum yield or quality. Now, the authors also recognize some limitations with this study. Generally, they were limited in how many single time period samples, 3 to 14 days before calving. That's a fairly wide range. On the other hand, it's hard to predict the exact day of calving. So that was somewhat of a limitation. And the farms and samples in the study were from a population which volunteered. So that's another factor. Um, then, in addition, the herd size was quite a bit larger than the average in New York State, but also they have more numbers available, so you got more information available. And then one other confounding factor was they mentioned oxytocin. In some cases, dairies may use oxytocin to make sure that all of the colostrum is extracted, and sometimes they use it even into lactation. But in this case, they were not able to identify exactly how much of that was going on, and so they couldn't tell for sure how much that might have affected some of these values, depending on whether herd was using it or not. And then, of course, the nutrition and farm management was indicative of of mid to large size dairies as opposed to the average size dairy within New York. So, what this amounts to is that they have found that there are multiple factors, as they found in their model, that related to colostrum yield and the quality of the colostrum. But on the other hand, there's not any one or two that can be singled out to say, if you do this, you'll have better quality and more volume, or if you don't do this, you won't. It's unfortunately not that simple yet. So that's the result of this. And of course, the other thing is it's a good database now to extract, and I'm aware that I think part of this data will be featured at a symposium at the American Dairy Science Association this summer in June.
Very good. Before we get to our Q&A, I just want to remind our audience you can post any questions that you might have for Dr. Kertz there in the chat or in the comments section of your social media channel you're watching from. Also, if you haven't seen already, Dr. Kertz's column on this topic can be found in the chat, or you can find it in the latest digital edition of Feedstuffs. Al, just a question for you. What would be, an issue for farms maybe volunteering for this study?
Well, it's going to be another aggravating factor. Somebody's going to be accessing their records. They're going to come on there and talk to their employees. It's always, if nothing else, maybe a nuisance factor. So that depends on the dairy, their outlook. The dairy might say, well, I'd like to have more information about my farm. So I would welcome you to come in and look through my records, and then you share that information with me. So it's a combination of those factors. That depends on who's going to be willing to volunteer.
So, for those producers at home, what would you say is the bottom line in all this research?
I think the bottom line is really keep good detailed records, because then you have the opportunity within your own records to go back and look at things. One of the things that was required by the dairies that participated in the study was that the employees would initial off on records when they recorded information. That might sound like a small thing, but on a dairy, when you have calving going around the clock 24 hours, you might have 3 shifts of people, and then you have a weekend shift. So you have a number of people who come through and participate in cows calving and taking colostrum and sampling it and so on. And so maybe it turns out that somebody's not doing a good job. And if you have that information and there's a problem, you can go back and look at, was this a certain shift or a certain individual that wasn't doing a good job of following the protocol? And that's why we had a problem at that particular time. So if you have those records and data, then you can go back and do some checking when problems result. And maybe it's because the protocol is not being followed that well.
Definitely something to go back on and check with your employees. Dr. Kurtz, thank you so much for your insight today.
You're welcome.
We appreciate you joining us as well. A reminder that you can view this interview along with a number of Feedstuffs 365 exclusive interviews on feedstuffs.com. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Ann Hess.